We were talking a moment ago, and the question came up, what is an urbanist? And so let me kind of address that before we go on. It's kind of a blanket term that derived from the term the new urbanism that was begun about 30 years ago by a bunch of people that actually were not urban planners. Most of the pioneers of the new urbanism were architects at the beginning. Over time, it's actually turned into a group of, it's quite a broad-based group. There's even one dentist that's a member of the Congress for the New Urbanism. And so you don't have to have a particular qualification. And I should say something as well about the work that I do. We were talking this morning, as a matter of fact, there's nothing really that I've done in the last 10 years or so that I'm at all qualified to do. Okay, I'm completely unqualified for everything I've done over the last decade or so. But the important thing that I've found in that length of time is that if you have a lot of passion for something, and if you have some knowledge of it, then you will learn far more by the time you get to the end of the project than you ever knew at the beginning. For example, every book I've ever written, I knew relatively little about the subject material, but I had a lot of passion for it. I knew something about it, but I had a lot of passion for it. And so I was not an expert at the beginning of writing the book, but you sort of move in that direction by the time you get to the end. So if anybody in the room has something that you do have a lot of passion for, but you say, I'm unqualified for that, well, so what? If you have the passion and some knowledge, that's what you need to actually get started, because you will become qualified in the process of doing whatever the task is that you have the passion to do. So let's get into it here. One thing I've got to say, I spent the early morning hours this morning in my hotel room going over the Wayward Green document from beginning to end. And I really have to say, it really is an impressive piece of work that you guys have put together here. It includes actually a whole lot of stuff that you don't normally find in city sustainability initiatives. And so I'm really delighted to see that you've taken a broader view of sustainability than what typically occurs. Normally, all discussions about sustainability are just about what I refer to as gizmo green, which is the proposition that with better equipment and better materials we can achieve sustainability. Well, that's a part of the equation, but only a small part as we'll see right at the very end. But you've identified sprawl. This is shot from the air yesterday coming into town. It's not too far from the airport. But you've identified sprawl, in this case eating up farmland as it normally does, as being possibly the biggest issue that Edmonton will face over the next 30 years, and you're exactly right about that. You've also identified food in your sources for food is an important thing, and that's exactly right as well. One thing that we're kind of conditioned to think in terms of, and that is, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've primarily thought of stuff in terms of the mechanical paradigm. In other words, making everything like a machine, like your heart is a pump, your brain is a wired network or whatever. And so when you do that, it's all about how do things operate. What you discover is that if you want to get stuff done right, it takes lots of controls, not just the physical kind like this, but the human controls as well. There have to be a lot of things that line up. Again, not just the physical alignments, but this bureau has to line up with that department has to line up with that company, and so forth. And all of this takes a massive use of energy, both the physical kind and the human kind as well. This proposition that I've been working on trying to figure out for the last 33 years or 32 years, whatever it is, or so, that I call the original green. And the original green is actually the sustainability that existed up until the beginning of the thermostat age. The thermostat age is the time since when we think we can flip a switch and make everything okay. But the original green is the sustainability that kept humans alive for almost all of human history before that. Otherwise, we simply wouldn't have been here. And so another way of putting it is it is a system of aggregating and curating and distributing the wisdom of sustainability broadly. And it's based not on a mechanical paradigm, but on an organic paradigm. So what we're asking here is we're saying, what are things that could, with a little encouragement, take on a life of their own and grow? And so what we're looking for things that can have life, and we want to find out where they thrive, how we can get there, and how we can participate, because it's a whole lot easier, for example, to plant a tomato seed and let nature take its course than it is to try to invent a factory that will actually manufacture a tomato. That'd be really tough, you know, and it'd take a lot of work. Whereas, you know, you plant the seed and keep it warm enough and you know, water it, and then that's about all you have to do. So there is a book I wrote a couple of years ago by that title. A lot of what you're going to see here, because I'm always trying to figure more stuff out, so a lot of what you see here is not in the book, but some of the stuff is. It starts out actually with the idea that there's a number of things that we're doing today that we hope and think will lead us to sustainability, but they're actually kind of broken promises, or we'll find out later that they're broken promises. And I have a top 10 of those. I don't have time to talk about them all, but I will mention a couple. Number 10 is the absence of plain-spoken sustainability. Now, I will always plead for the very common sense, plain-spoken definition, which is to say that sustainability is something that you can keep going in a healthy way long into an uncertain future. Okay? If you can't do that, it's simply not sustainable. It doesn't matter how many green points or industry accolades you get. Number 5 is the trouble with consumption. As anyone from that has ever been to Easter Island knows, if you consume everything, you end up with no resources and a lot of garbage, and so we basically have done that. Matter of fact, people say that in the U.S. anyway, where I'm from, they say, well, it's your patriotic duty to consume more and more. And you know, they say we were founded as a consuming economy. I beg your pardon, we were not. Every country until the mid-1920s was founded with a conserving economy where things are valued by how long they're handed down, not how quickly they're used up. Okay? Matter of fact, the idea of planned obsolescence was only invented in the mid-1920s by a bunch of industrialists that said, hey, if we can make stuff wear out quicker, then we can sell more stuff, and so we'll make more money, and so they did. Unfortunately, we've let that infect placemaking in recent times to where we build throwaway buildings, you know, where stuff's falling off in the driveway in 10 years, you know? I mean, think about it. You probably know where this has happened. And then we do the throwaway places as well. Look at this. Other than that tree, which has been there for, you know, before they built this place, every other tree there is less than 10 years old. They have thrown away this place in less than 10 years. How can we even dream of calling ourselves sustainable if we keep throwing places away? Number 3 on that list of 10 is the carbon focus. I have no idea, but that building could be LEED platinum. It could even be carbon neutral for all I know, because you can't tell by looking. But what's exceptionally obvious is the inhabitation of that building is anything but sustainable, because you have to drive everywhere in order to inhabit it. And so as long as we're just focused on the carbon footprint of buildings, then we're really missing the big picture of sustainability. And number 2 is the supply side focus. This is how many miles we've driven up until 2006 when I did the diagram, and if you extrapolate that trend on upwards, that's where it gets to by 2030. Now in the U.S., in 2007 they had an energy bill which for the first time in 30 years mandated increased efficiency, and it only went out to 2020, but I extended the effect of it on out to 2030. And so if you apply that level of consumption to the increased efficiency, the yellow line is what you get. That's a problem. It's still going up. Okay, if we want to get anywhere towards sustainability, we got to bring the line back down again, and nobody has a proposition for doing that. Here's the real core problem, and that is our consumption is increasing faster than the engineer's ability to increase efficiency. Okay, so sustainability is not something you get by going shopping. Okay? It happens when we don't change our shopping habits necessarily, but we change ourselves. That's a bigger thing to ask for, but it's something that will actually work. And the number 1 problem is what I call the 2.5 billion people. Just in China and in India, just those 2 countries, and there's other populous countries as well that are doing the same thing right now, but just those 2 countries, there's about 2.5 billion people that are in the process of moving from, over a number of years, from a very low impact agrarian lifestyle into the city. Now, if they do 2.5 times as well in China and in India as the U.S. has done in their need for cars in the city. You know, in the U.S., we have 300 million people and 300 million cars. So if they do 2.5 times as well as that, then in a few years there will be 1 billion cars on the road just in those two countries that don't even exist today. Okay, so I don't care what you think about peak oil. This is just economics 101. If you increase demand that much more, then you're going to have an incredible impact, both in terms of the ecological impact and also the economic impact. Both of them are going to see a huge change in the near future. So what can we do? Well, I have a top 10 here as well, and I'm only going to mention 2 or 3 of those. Number 1 is expanded comfort range. You know, in the books they say that the human comfort range is 10 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. My grandparents could be comfortable in a 30-degree range from 60 degrees Fahrenheit to about 90. You know, 60 they'd put on a sweater, at 90 they'd have a little handheld fan, but in between they were okay. Today we have thermostat wars all over the U.S. over 2 degrees on the thermostat. You know, I mean, we do. It's like people are fighting over what it's going to be. So the human comfort range has shrunk to the least degree in human history. Matter of fact, since the beginning of the thermostat age, what we've done is we've designed a building, wrapped some style around it. The style is a material, called in the engineers, they size the load, size the equipment, and they put these things on the wall so we condition the buildings. Look over here. Do you see anybody suffering? Nobody's suffering there, right? What they're also doing, in addition to sitting out on the streets of Paris and having an espresso or whatever, but what they're also doing is they're conditioning themselves, whether they realize it or not, to the local environment so that when they return indoors, they need less mechanical conditioning to be comfortable. Now, I moved to South Beach several years before LeBron did, although he had a really good term for it. But anyhow, so I moved down there about 9 years ago, and I moved in the fall. And so I had the wintertime there, which is nothing like wintertime here, obviously, to get acclimated. And because I walk everywhere, I still have a car, but I only crank it a couple times a week. Because I walk everywhere, I can accurately say that I have never been in the shade outdoors and in a breeze and been uncomfortable. I just haven't in the whole time I've been there. I will even, sometimes when I'm working from home, my office doesn't allow this, but you know, because of the way it's designed, but when I'm working from home, I will sometimes or very often actually, just open the windows, cut on the ceiling fan, and have no air conditioning on at all. And in July, in the town where the basketball team is named the Heat. Okay, so it actually does work. Now, obviously, when it's 40 below zero here, you're not going to be outdoors. I mean, you're just not. But there is a potential to, if you're more conditioned by enticing people outdoors, there is a potential to actually have equipment off for months of the year that you wouldn't think you could have it off for. And what it leads to is a condition that I call living in season. You know, if you're eating in season, you're eating the food that's coming into season at that time in the place that you live. If you live in season, that is a condition of being so acclimated that you can actually throw the windows open for a good bit of the year. Number 3 is the localized operations. If you look over here, Waffle House gets most of their customers from this bridge. That's a tractor-trailer rig. The driver would be too small to see. And so what they have to do is put up a 200-foot tall sign that probably costs $200,000. And then they have to pave every stitch of the lot that's left over after the Waffle House is built so all their customers can drive there and then they can serve them. So is there any shadow of a doubt why poor old Waffle House is so ugly? They have completely blown the budget on operating at a great distance. Over here, on the other hand, this guy has walked up to within about 8 feet of that sign, so it can cost $200 rather than $200,000. And as a result, that saves enough money that these guys can afford to pay the high rents on Nantucket. Would you rather work here? Or would you rather work there? You know, just think about it. This is a self-diagnosis that everyone needs to do. This is mine. I call this the web of daily life. Here's my home, and then my office. It's about a 5-block walk. And then here's the park, here's the post office, here's my doctor's office, the accountant's office, the bank, Here's the vitamin store. Here's the grocery store closest to home, 4 blocks away. And this is one of 3 grocery stores within 2 blocks of the office. So we buy groceries by the meal, not by the week. The hardware store is far enough that we normally ride a bike up there, but we have baskets on the bike, so that works out. Okay, here's the bookstore. Here's the Apple store. Here's a number of my favorite restaurants, but there's probably 200 restaurants within the picture here. I like to run, so there's one 3-mile run, and another, and another, and another. So when you put them all together, the necessities and the recreation, you end up with the thing that I call the web of daily life. Now, what you need to do, remember we're talking about the 2.5 billion people and what the cost of fuel is going to do. When it does get to, well, in the U.S., I'm using U.S. terms, I have no idea what fuel costs here, but in the U.S., when it gets to $10 a gallon and then $20 a gallon, how many pieces of your web of daily life are going to be clipped because you can't afford to do it anymore? I mean, it's a very serious thing. Everyone needs to run their own self-diagnosis. So we're talking about the original green, which is basically the sustainability that all our ancestors knew by heart. It starts with this proposition, and that is, we must first of all build sustainable places before it makes any sense to talk about green buildings. Those sustainable places should be nourishable and accessible and serviceable and securable, and then those green buildings should be first of all lovable and durable and flexible and frugal. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually just talk about nourishability, accessibility, and serviceability, and then we just don't have time to get into the others today, but that in a large way defines what the urbanism is about. And I don't know enough of your conditions here. I actually had the securable part in there at the beginning as well, but I actually don't know anything about Edmonton because I just arrived for the first time yesterday. So not knowing what your conditions are there, then I'm not going to guess at them. The others are probably easier to guess because you can see, what you can just see from the air coming in. A nourishable place is one where you can look out onto the fields and onto the waters from which much of your food comes. Years ago when I first started talking about this, people said, "Steve, you're an idiot. I can eat anything I want, anywhere I want. It really doesn't matter." But of course now we're all starting to realize that, maybe it is a better idea if food comes from closer around us. Today, if you look at your plate this evening, other than the grains, probably most everything else on your plate needed a passport to get to you. They used to say that the average distance traveled, if you average it all up, is about 1,500 miles on whatever is on your plate. In reality, that's a pretty old number. I'd be surprised if it isn't closer to 2,000 miles now. A lot of stuff will come from South America, especially in the wintertime in the Northern Hemisphere. And you say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, when you're raising food in Central and South America, and it has to endure a 3 or 4 week trip in the back of a truck, we've had to genetically engineer those foods to be so durable for that trip that they've lost a lot of their taste and lost a lot of their nourishment as well. If you doubt that, just cut open an heirloom tomato and a grocery store tomato and see for yourself. There's another problem as well, and that is the whole idea of food security. Now, in the UK, a couple of years ago, their grocery prices spiked about 40% over a period of 2 or 3 months because of just an exchange rate in the pound changing. And so the people they were buying from, because the currency exchange changing, that raised the cost of groceries that much. And so then there's also political issues. In the U.S., we get a lot of our food now from some countries in South America that don't actually like us much anymore. Of course, in the U.S., a lot of countries don't like us much anymore. So that's actually kind of a low threshold. And then if you think about agribusiness and the fact that it's all completely petroleum driven, as the cost of fuel goes up, that becomes a big issue as well. The problem with the industrial food chain is something it can't help, and that is because it necessarily operates at such a great scale. You don't build factories for turning out 30 things of yogurt a day. You build factories for huge quantities, and so everything about the industrial food chain is for that. As a result, it must be a bad neighbor. You need things like crop dusting. You need things like a 1,000 hog farm or something like that. Nobody wants to live 10 miles downwind of that. you know, because of how it smells. And you know, it does things like fouling the runoff and burning out the fields with chemical fertilizer. And I've heard that if anybody has ever been to a CAFO, a confined animal feeding operation, it may turn you into a vegetarian. I've never been to one, and I do eat some meat, but it's something to think about. On the other hand, there is an alternative that I call good neighbor agriculture, and that basically is biointensive agriculture that is a completely different pattern. It's what humans use to raise food for most of history, or at least most of our farming history, and it can snuggle right up to a town or village or whatever. On the one hand, the industrial food chain is very man-hour efficient because you might have one guy on a huge tractor that might tend 1,000 acres a day. But then the biointensive agriculture is very acre efficient. It's not so man-hour efficient. But then here's the problem too. When people are talking about man-hour efficient, they're just thinking about the guy on the tractor. They're not considering all the people working in agribusiness, in the truckers and the factory workers and all this. So it really is kind of a false, it's a false efficiency, really, is what it amounts to. As a matter of fact, Michael Pollan says that by the time you combine the caloric content of the food and of the oil, it takes 80 calories of the two of those to produce 1 calorie of final processed food. I mean, so it's incredibly calorically inefficient. Also, you can't pay someone in the U.S. little enough to farm and put, unless it's grain, you know, which is a huge scale, but to raise vegetables, put them into the industrial food chain, you know, they throw you in prison. It's called minimum wage laws. So what do? Well, we take that guilt about not wanting to pay people so little, and we just export that to other countries. And it's like, well, you know, if that happens there, then that doesn't really matter. This whole family down in Panama made about $2 a day altogether. At the end of the day, they go and live in a windowless plywood box. But there's a new way of thinking about it as well. This is an organic farm that's only 5 acres in the Bahamas. Now, they do have a long growing season there, but on 5 acres and 5 employees, their gross income is $5 million a year. Okay, let that sink in. I mean, it's, you know, you always thought that farmers starved. Well, but when you combine the fact that that there's no middleman, people just come there and get food, or they deliver directly to the restaurants. Now, some of that is a little restaurant they have on site, but nonetheless, I mean, it really is. So when you combine the local with the extra value of organic, it's a different equation now than what it used to be. So this biointensive stuff, it can be tightly embedded around the urbanism that it serves. It's also very opportunistic. You'll never get a 2-story tall John Deere tractor into this plot of land, but since it's not tended by those, it works. In the U.S., we have a fit if anybody tries to develop land that is 20% or more of grade. And look at this. That's over 100%, and they've been raising food, feeding those people on those terraces for centuries now. It also can be multi-layered. Normally, you'll have a ground layer and then an arbor layer, and sometimes even a 3rd layer of fruit trees even above that. So you're getting multiple things off the same piece of land. There's a number of different scales, beginning with the employing farm, which is outside of town, where you need to actually hire a few people to help you farm it. And then there's the family farm that's small enough that it can be tended just by a single family. That normally would be an acre or 2 thereabouts. Then moving into the urbanism is the allotment garden, where several neighbors will share smaller plots, and then the edge yard garden and the courtyard garden, the roof or terrace garden, the arbor garden, the wall garden, the balcony garden, and finally the window garden. So it's a whole range of different scales. And then finally, not everybody wants to be a gardener, much less a farmer. And so what you need is, in every single neighborhood in a city should have their own farmers market, so you can be supporting the local agriculture from outside of town. Okay, well, let's move on to the accessible places. An accessible place is one where you have a variety of choices of accessing that place, especially including the self-propelled ways of walking and biking, because it doesn't matter what the price of gas goes to, as long as you're able-bodied and living in an accessible place, you'll always be able to get around. In the U.S., we have a problem that I refer to as automobile poverty, and that is that the average cost of owning a car, from the payments to the gas to the oil to the insurance, to, you know, all that stuff, is between $7,000 and $10,000 a year, depending on where you live. And so in this case, this family, who obviously live in an unwalkable place because everybody has to have a car to be economically viable, in other words, to have a job, they have 5 cars. And so if you take the low end of the spectrum, because there's no Mercedes there, but if you take the low end of the spectrum, multiply that by $7,000 a year, then that's $35,000 a year that they're paying just to get around. Now, $35,000 a year makes a pretty nice house payment. So if they lived in a completely walkable place, they could live in a much nicer house than what they're currently living in. Another thing to consider as well is the price of speed. This is Renaissance Florence. Okay, that's the size of the city in the Renaissance. At the same scale, this is Spaghetti Junction in Atlanta. Now what I did is I started at the point where the off-ramps began at this interchange, but as you can see, that one interchange is bigger than Renaissance Florence. Matter of fact, the turning radii in here are so small that they're really invisible at this scale. But you have to do this if everybody is traveling at highway speed and you want to get from here to there. I mean, it forces it. So it's not like the traffic engineers are bad guys or anything. It's just that speed necessitates that. Here's a closer look at what happens. When you have to have huge thoroughfares, and then of course you have all this space, and if somebody runs off the road, they won't run into a house, they'll just run into a tree or whatever. Then if you add up the total acres here that are totally worthless, in other words, there's no real estate to be sold here, it has no actual value, then compare that with traditional urbanism. This is actually the town of Seaside, Florida, but it looks a whole lot like, in terms of the scale of it, that looks a whole lot like traditional urbanism that is old as well. And what happens here, if you compare this with that, you'll see this has basically a little over twice as much worthless land in the development pattern as this does. So you're really asking for a big hit. Here's another way of looking at the same pieces of property as well. These are the front streets, so they have full value of whatever that value is. Very often real estate is sold by the front foot rather than by the acre. These are the side streets that have no addresses on them, and then over here is only a partial value frontage because it has a parking lot behind it. And then of course these are the frontages that have no value whatsoever because you can't have a shop right on the edge of the interstate. They won't let you do that. Compare that to Seaside, where every single frontage has real estate that can be sold. So it just simply creates more value. When you talk about walkability, you can't say that Edmonton is walkable or Miami is walkable or whatever. It's much more fine-grained than that. This is Miami. I live out on South Beach up at the very top. One of the most walkable places in the U.S. south of Manhattan. But some parts of Miami, down here in Coral Gables, are somewhat walkable. If you go down here to Kendall, just off the screen here, it's one of the most unwalkable places on planet Earth. So you really need to be talking on not even a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, it's really a street by street basis. And character really matters. Nobody will ever walk on this sidewalk unless the car breaks down. They just won't. Over here, people walk there and enjoy that walk every day. Now, one thing I want to point out, and that is that all of the pictures that I take are not posed. I shoot first and ask permission later. And so these are just people doing what they normally do, anything you see in my shots, and I just ask them later. Also, if it's a walkable place, then it probably is a good site for other things that enhance wellness. In other words, it's probably a good running place as well. The real standard of what we're trying to do is we're saying, how can we actually have more neighbors on the streets than cars, and have the cars behave in such a way that the neighbors aren't scared? One of the things that we need to do is try to build more of an alley network or rear lane network, because then you get all the garbage and mess and stuff to the rear of the buildings, and then what that does, that makes the frontages a whole lot more beautiful and enticing for people to walk along those frontages. There's some things you can do with the buildings themselves that enhance that walkability as well by making it more enticing. And one really, really important thing to do wherever you possibly can, is get more on-street parking. Because every car that you put on the street in a thriving retail district will create about $250,000 worth of sales for the merchants of that street every single year. Also, you see this woman sitting here at the little sidewalk cafe. There's no possible way that she'd be sitting there if this is traveling cars, you know, going by at 35 miles an hour. You know, you'd be dead. But because the cars protect the sidewalk, that they actually make sidewalk cafes possible. They would be impossible without it. And there's a lot of other reasons. We could talk for 20 minutes just about other reasons to want to have on-street parking. There's just a lot of them. This is an idea I've been working on for several years now. I'm trying to really sort of get it coagulated at this point. It's something I call pedestrian propulsion. Basically, that is to say, there's a number of characteristics that either help to propel you along your way or impede you from wanting to walk further. You know, we have this abstract construct that we call the 5-minute walk, and we say that if people can walk somewhere in 5 minutes, then they'll probably walk rather than drive. But that's actually just very abstract. As you can see here, you know, in a power center, if you're at an Old Navy and you want to go to the Best Buy or whatever, you're not going to walk across the parking lot. You'll get in your car and drive to as close as you can get to the front door of the other store. You know, so there's the quarter-mile radius here, but we actually walk much less than that in a bad pedestrian environment. Over here, on the other hand, this is the Piazza del Popolo in Rome. That's the Vittorio Emanuele. People, and obviously that's a lot further than a quarter of a mile. These are both at the same scale, but people regularly walk that every day, all day long. It's such a great walk. They'll even walk further than that in a great city with great urbanism like that. So I'm proposing several levels of pedestrian propulsion. I'm saying that the highest standard, I'm calling it the London standard, but it could be London, Rome, Paris, and any of the great cities, especially of Europe. And so that gets the highest rating. And there you will walk, people regularly walk 2 miles there instead of driving. The next one is what I'm calling the T5 standard. T5 is like a typical main street in the U.S. And there people will walk about 3/4 of a mile without driving. And then the quarter-mile radius is actually about right for what we call T4, which is just general urban neighborhoods. And there they will walk about 1/4 of a mile on the average. T3, which is a suburban condition, they'll only walk about 1/10 of a mile. And then if you get in a subdivision, this is in Levittown in New York, and there they'll walk maybe 250 feet. If you're here and your neighbor is 5 houses down and they're 50-foot lots, that's about as far as you're going to go before you get in your car and drive. If you're at the power center, like we were looking at a minute ago, you'll walk 100 feet. And you remember this sidewalk that we looked at a minute ago? I'm saying 25 feet, but really nobody's ever going to walk there unless the car breaks down. You know, and so this predicts so many things from the viability of neighborhood retail to the reason that the Europeans walk a lot further than people from the U.S. because they just have cities with better pedestrian propulsion. Let's take a look as well at this example of a subdivision, a typical subdivision, and this was in Santa Fe. I happen to be doing a lecture there, and I've compared it to a T&D. Both of them are on 90 acres, and this is not a real traditional neighborhood. It's more rigid than one would be, but I've tried to get the metric of the mix of units that you normally have. And then, so like I say, 90 acres both, 114 units here, 814 over there. No shops over there, almost 100 square feet of shops per unit over here. In this one, there's no civic space. Here, you got a square in the middle, and then you have 4 pocket parks and playgrounds. Then here you have about 13 feet of arterial per unit. That's the big roadway out here. This one has no arterial, but it has a main street on the other hand, which creates a lot of real estate value where the arterial creates none. It's not allowed to create any. Then if you look at the local streets, there's about 3,650 square feet of paving per unit over here, a little less than 1,000 over here. And so, I mean, it's just a huge amount of paving per unit more that you have over here. The driveways are an average of 108 feet in length over here, and about 5 feet over here because you're simply pulling in right off the alley into the garage at the rear of the unit. And for public safety, you can, police or fire can protect 46 units per mile traveled, and front access only, they protect 175 over here. So the same police car or the same fire truck can protect 4 times as many citizens in this condition as they can in the other. And then the utilities, you know, it's 115 feet of utilities per unit and about 30 feet over here, so almost a 4 times difference there as well. If you look at traffic, then this gets the full load miles, which means that you're driving on almost every trip. And then over here, you're getting cars on less of the trips. So basically, it's saving about a trip and a half per day. And that's only based on today's estimates. It actually will be bigger than that in the future. Another thing to think about it as well, and that is, so long as this piece remains inhabited. Now, if it ever becomes a ghost town, this doesn't apply. But so long as people are living here, then you don't need to build this much of the other stuff. So it's what I call perpetual land preservation. Matter of fact, this is leading to one thing that I wish I had time to talk about and I don't. But that is that the biggest thing, the biggest challenge we all have ahead is what do we do to repair sprawl? Let's quickly look at the serviceable places. A few things on that. First of all, when you build a serviceable place, it knits the town together. I just come back from Spain and went to Dallas for a lecture, which the big boulevards there, or arterials really, had the exact same width, okay? But here, the town was meeting there. There, if you went on the road, you'd be dead. And people say, well, you know, if you talk about neighborhood retail, that's going to reduce my property value. Well, it will do it if it looks like that, but that's not what we're talking about. On the affordability side, I mentioned that. You know, there's several things. Smaller cottages than you would ever think. That's a 1-bedroom. Also, rear lane addresses. There's much bigger houses on the front street here. London does the same thing, except more urban with their mews. And then the live-work unit, I'm predicting, is going to be the hottest real estate type over the next 30, 40 years because they've been so underserved recently. There's a classic where you live above the shop. Here's one where you're working in the apartment frontage, working in the row house frontage, working in the detached house frontage. This one is the work behind, that's the workshop and back. And this is what I'm calling the work nearby. I don't know if this person actually lives there and works there, but they could do it. And then we also need to think about how to transition from just residential. In this case, the house was built first. And then they built the office here, and they also have the shop over here that you can see. And so we need to think about charming and enticing ways of doing that. Finally, we're talking at the beginning, you know, you saw this diagram. What I've done is I've gone in here and I've marked the things that we know how to do. Whether we do them or not, it's just do we know how to do them or not. Gizmo green actually has a role in frugal buildings. Okay, it's not the major role because doing the natural things, kind of the passive things, it is the major role. But there is a role here. Unfortunately, all of the major national and international discussions that are happening right now about green building are all about Gizmo green. So as you can see, they're completely missing the big picture of what sustainability is all about. So that's what I've got. Real quickly, originalgreen.org. If you write that down, that's a site where I blog regularly, and I would love for everyone to join the discussion there if you would. So thank you very much.